Thank you, Liz, for these very friendly words of introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My heartfelt thanks go again to Liz Perry here for making this roundtable possible and for being such a great teacher, colleague, and friend over the years. And thanks also go to Lindsay Strogatz for her meticulous preparation of this event. So in this brief statement, I will deal with Chinese borrowings from East Asian neighbors with regard to economic governance and development strategy. And I will focus on only a few fundamental issues and mainly on interactions with Japan, China and Japan. As all of you know, Chinese-Japanese relations are rather tense and precarious at present, but this was different in the recent past, particularly in the 1980s, when Japan was seen as the most instructive development model by Chinese economic administrators. And then something interesting happened from today's point of view. Many of those young Chinese officials who were deeply impressed by the Japanese experiences in the 1980s, they are now sitting at the very top of Chinese economic policy making. More concretely, they are heading the staff office of China's Central Financial and Economic Leading Group at present. The same young officials that were deeply impressed by Japan in the 1980s. Since I had the opportunity to talk with some of them during recent years in the course of my research project on industrial and technology policies, I can say that the appreciation of Japan is not gone. And the willingness to absorb lessons from Japan's experiences, positive and negative ones, is alive. And it is shaping policies in China to the present day. And this might be some kind of surprising finding from my fieldwork. Let me start with some overarching points with this very complex world map here. Too much information on it, but it's just a big picture here. In economic governance, we find a very wide funnel for learning on the Chinese side. And this is particularly important with regard to the core challenge for the Communist Party. The core challenge for the Communist Party is how to maintain state guidance in an increasingly decentralized economy. And in order to explain the changing orientations in China's economic governance, let me turn to the ebbs and flows in the transnational dissemination of the planning agenda, as I call it. This is the world, what the world map is actually about here. This map illustrates that comprehensive development planning constitutes a globally traveling concept and institution with crude command and control origins in all the war economies, then hyper-formalized in Soviet industrial input-output planning, and then interestingly made compatible with markets in Japan and other East Asian countries. And these experiences were recently recombined and even reinvigorated in China. Much of that has been not on the radar screen of Western research so far, but there's really some huge comeback of national development planning in China underway since the last decade. On this world map here, China is shown as a place of gravitation that has absorbed diverse methodologies. In the 1980s, Japanese practices of indicative planning, as we call it, in social science, and indicative planning and industrial policy became a central point of reference to Chinese leaders. And it is fascinating how intense and diverse the channels of Chinese-Japanese exchanges were in this period. It is equally fascinating how Japanese-style sectoral industrial policy has received a formidable push in China recently. Beyond the Japanese reference model, the Chinese approach, this is also depicted here, the Chinese approach to foreign experiences has become pronouncedly eclectic since the 1980s. Chinese officials, policy advisors, they have looked to South Korea and to Singapore for human resources and for technology planning. We hear about that later in the panel. They have looked to Germany for functional spatial planning, to Scandinavian countries for health system planning, all sorts of interesting. But clearly, and that's the topic of our panel here, East Asian experiences have come to be the most easily adapted ingredients due to commonalities such as close government-business interaction, the challenge of state guidance of markets, or the combination of political nationalism, that's an important point, the combination of political nationalism with international economic expansion and competitiveness. In addition, terminological borrowing, I think that's very important, and concept diffusion has often been much easier and more direct within the East Asian context. In general, Chinese policymakers have come to treat foreign practices as a selection menu They pick what they see as useful and compatible with the Chinese context, and then they modify and adapt it. But what were the driving forces behind the spread of these first imported methodologies? Of utmost importance have been the demonstration effects, and that's something that's quite tricky, and the perceived successes of foreign models that served as the foundation for asymmetrical borrowing. So economic models, economic benchmarks, they have regularly shifted with domestic and with global ideologies and success stories. China's economic leaders, you know that, identified first the Soviet Union, then Japan, and later even the United States as the global number one, as the benchmark model. And strikingly, that's the joke that came up in many conversations, all these models lost their dynamism and appeal after China started to learn from them. So there's a biting joke there in Chinese, 中国向谁学习，谁就失败. So if China starts to emulate a foreign country, this country is doomed. So according to this logic, and that might be interesting for Occupy Wall Street will be finished as soon as China liberalizes its financial market. So maybe the lobbying efforts should be directed towards Beijing, not to Washington in the night. As soon as governments began to lose executive authority and continuity, that's not shown here, efforts at state guidance came to be severely weakened in both Japan and South Korea. In China, the stage has not been reached yet. There, the planning ambition has recently become even more outspoken. Again, let me briefly turn to the challenge of controlled, piecemeal opening up of financial markets, one of the most hotly debated topics in Chinese policy-making circles and economic policy. There were Taiwanese policy approaches that were interesting there, how to do it in a controlled way, opening up to the international financial markets. And we have a qualified foreign institutional investor scheme, QFII, was imported wholesale from Taiwan to do it in a controlled way, and then the Chinese started to modify it, to broaden it, to adapt it. Then they had a QDII, for outbound Chinese investment, a qualified domestic institutional investor scheme. And now they have, quite recently, an RQFII, quite interesting, a renminbi in Chinese yuan, denominated qualified foreign institutional investor scheme. So originally the idea, the instrument came from Taiwan, was actually tried out already in the late 90s and until over the last decade, and then it was refined, it was broadened, it was just shaped by this context in China that had different demands on that. But more fundamental, and this is something that I would call learning ex negativo, so from the negative examples of Japan, in currency policy, China is determined to avoid what is called in the domestic debate premature external liberalization, currency convertibility. And this is seen in the Japanese experience with the Plaza Accord, which is sometimes called the Plaza Accord trap. So core lessons for both Japan and in an earlier stage and China today from this perspective is reducing vulnerability and exposure to their main debtor, and that is the US. It was the US for Japan, 1980s, 1990s, and it's the US for China today. So what is some people are quite funny about that and quite direct in their wordings, it's getting out of the dollar trap, something like that. You know, this is something that we can learn from Japan from the Chinese perspective. So it's the progressive loss of control by the Japanese government over credit allocation and currency rates that is a severe lesson from the perspective of many policymakers, policy advisors in the environment of the central bank in China. So it's the entire present-day Chinese strategy is shaped by this lesson, I would argue. This also explains the Chinese currency offensive in the wake of the global financial crisis, the criticism of the dollar's role in the international monetary system, which was called a product of the past by the former state president of China, Hu Jintao. And the way out of this perceived trap is quite idiosyncratic. The Chinese have really taken a new way. It's a controlled and reversible capital account liberalization. We didn't have that in this way before. It's piloted by way of Hong Kong. It's reversible experimentation with currency internationalization through Hong Kong. And then it was broadened through currency swap agreements with major trading partners outside the US and Europe. So it's going beyond the US and Europe. It's actually choosing these preferential trading partners and swap agreement partners outside of the US and Europe. The core of the strategy is internationalizing the Chinese yuan within a system of capital controls. Strange idea. Thereby, the Chinese government and central bank, they enter completely unknown territory through a typically experimental approach that is inspired by the negative lessons from Japan. The ultimate strategic goals, alliances are very different. That's clear between Japan and China, their relationship with the US. It was international competitiveness for Japan and the security alliance with the US that was paramount in the Japanese case, whereas to China it is about securing the ruling elite's grip on power while not being an ally or a dependent of the United States. So that's what I want to say about the learning ex negativo. Finally, a few words on the inspiration that Chinese spatial planners, urbanization planners, are currently drawing from Japanese megacities and Japanese experiences with spatial planning, a very important topic, much underrated, not reported in the media, in the Western media, and not actually being studied in Western research so far. Big thing. The so-called principal function zoning plans. 主体功能区规划. That's a very special terminology also. These new principal function zoning plans in China, they have triggered a major reorientation in Chinese ecological planning. The key element lies in designating for all areas of the country 4 different types of principal development functions. It's about industrial upgrading, prioritizations for certain industrial developments, it's restrictions and even prohibitions for environmentally protected areas in China. It's all across provinces and even within urban agglomerations where this is undertaken presently. This is arguably the most comprehensive planning project that has come out of China during the last decade, and this has occurred almost unnoticed in the West, which is quite strange due to the idiosyncratic terminology, the non-political content, and most importantly, I believe, the incompatibility of this approach with our entrenched state versus market paradigm, because this is really going beyond anything that can be analyzed according to the state versus market paradigm. The new approach to spatial planning has been enshrined in the new government, including personnel changes. Maybe you've seen that. It's very strange for me because I did years of study on the NDRC, actually know a lot of people there, that they have now a minister, a new boss there, that comes from the Ministry of Land Administration and Resources, a geologist. And they were shocked by that at the beginning. But it's exactly what this is about. It's a new priority. It's a new priority project that's about urbanization, rural, urban, integrated development, and this spatial planning. There's one piece of good research that has come out by Vivian Xu recently, a fascinating analysis of this large-scale project. So the Japanese experience, that's what I'm driving at, the Japanese experience with spatial planning, indirect methods of spatial planning, is seen by Chinese planners as successful in narrowing the development and income gaps across regions through time. Is seen as successful in facilitating and expediting national integration of traffic, transport, and communication infrastructures across rural and urban concentrations. And at the same time, Chinese planners point to those developments in Japan that they see as a failure of original spatial plans, such as especially the over-dense urban agglomerations, the failure of parts of the integrated urban-rural planning in Japan. But this is a big program, so don't underestimate it. It was mentioned even in the financial ministry's report now as a priority project. There's lots of resources going into that. It's really a new approach to handling the ecological fallout, actually, of China's rise, economic rise. Let me finish with a cautiously optimistic message that might be surprising to some also. In spite of the current severe diplomatic and security tensions between China and Japan, there is a lot of respect and a lot of goodwill towards Japan among top-level economic planning officials in China's central government. And at the same time, importantly, senior Japanese officials have been very willing and very energetic to help China avoid problems that Japan went through. So there's a lot of exchange conferences and internal exchanges going on to optimize these new approaches to dealing with rapid development. So there are, and this is the core message of my statement here, there are major policy actors around in both countries that try to pursue a more constructive way to shape the bilateral relationship. And let us hope that these people prevail in shaping Chinese-Japanese relations in this constructive way. Let's discuss it later. Thank you very much.